Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today, we're going to be talking about this new buzz phrase that seems to be showing up in media, toxic masculinity. What is it? What isn't it? How is it being understood? Perhaps how it is being misunderstood? And how can we deconstruct this as Jungian analysts in a way that we can metabolize it and maybe find a deeper meaning? Maybe there's something that the culture is trying to speak to and trying to find language for. So, toxic masculinity, I'm wondering in terms of the feminine, in terms of the social justice sphere, how is the term being used?
This has sort of caught my attention recently because it does seem like it's become a buzz phrase, and I always find myself getting curious about phrases that sort of enter the common parlance in this way. Sort of what is that about? And, I think there's many ways to think about the term toxic masculinity, and I think it could have some validity. I think it's often getting used to imply that maleness itself is toxic.
I think so too. I think that that's an old story, the kind of man bashing. Mm-hmm. And actually, if we can look back to cartoons, even from the 50s, and, seeing Dagwood as this kind of moronic husband who's constantly sticking his foot in his mouth or is clueless about how to function outside of some narrow office position. This is an old kind of story, but I think that with the Me Too movement coming forward, there's a ferocity about this idea that men are toxic or anything that men touch is somehow spoiled.
Well, I think we have to take masculinity and kind of pull it apart from men. The concept of masculinity has certain kinds of words that would kind of define it as an archetype, as a set of mythological kinds of qualities. And that is different from men. Just as femininity is different from women, it's like yin and yang. They have their qualities, and we don't reduce it to something too concrete. I would add to that I'm really suspicious these days of these clever, cute little memes. And, our president, Donald Trump, is master of the meme. And I'm glad we're walking around this today because it deserves to be thought about rather than simply too conveniently phrased.
What was coming to mind just as you were talking about the archetypes is for all of us to remember that categories are not people. And how important that is. That just because we can typify something or categorize it does not mean that it is owned by a particular sex or gender or a particular subgroup. But it is still a worthy area of inquiry.
Well, I think kind of building on that, this whole idea of sort of masculine, that has so many different potential meanings. And, to your point, Deb, I'm wanting to drill down into a psychological and in particular a Jungian meaning of masculine. And, as with most things Jungian, masculine in the Jungian sense is not particularly well defined, but it might mean things like that which is active, that which is has an aggressive capacity, that which is discerning,
inseminating,
that which has to do with logos,
phallus,
that is phallic, that is maybe of spirit. And of course, that is not to say that those are qualities that only exist in males, in men, nor that women can't possess or embody those.
Absolutely. That all of the archetypes, all of these universal themes are available in every person, in every human psyche. So we've talked about these very broad categories, but I want to tighten the conversation down a little bit to this narrow feeling of when is the masculine category perceived as toxic or perhaps even mislabeled as toxic?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah,
for
that's the
instance,
question.
that's really that's the narrow question we're considering. And how, if masculine qualities are oppressive to the individual spirit, either of a man or a woman, that has to be questioned, particularly as Jungians, because we're looking towards this idea of individuation, that there is something in the spirit that is unique, that rejects being limited by characterization. So if we just take one, I think, a provocative word of aggression, which can show up in many realms, but right now it's being talked a lot about in terms of sexual aggression, pressing or even frightening or acting in some way to force or coerce another person into a sexual behavior and using that style to do it. And how provocative that is, how hurtful it can be, and how is it that men have come to believe or align with that particular use of aggression? Because there are ways that aggression can be so helpful to us for men and women.
But don't you think that, wait, you're asking, if I understand your question, you're asking, why are men sexually aggressive?
Yes. Yes. Why has aggression as a potential? But let's put it out there. So men and women have the potential to be aggressive, to actually have agency, to be able to pursue with a lot of vitality a goal.
Well, I don't know that that's exactly the definition that I have of aggression.
Okay, well then what would you say?
You know, using a certain amount of either psychological or physical force.
Towards a particular end, to achieve something.
Yes.
And in this realm, we might be saying to achieve a kind of sexual behavior.
And I would add that aggression is unempathic. Now, that doesn't necessarily, I don't want to make it right or wrong, so not to fall into those polarities, but it is unempathic. It is when a person decides that he or she is going to achieve this by force, by will, through agency, regardless of what other people's interests at that particular time might be.
It's perhaps purposefully deciding not to take into account how this is making the other person feel.
Yes, I think there's something about the word aggression that has to do with contending. That two forces are contending, and there is a sense that one force will win, versus, let's say, negotiation or collaboration in some way, which I think is part of the adrenaline and excitation around aggression versus, let's say, negotiation.
Yes. In aggression, I think one person wants something and exerts himself or herself to take it.
I think that's another step. That would be an extreme form of aggression, where somebody would actually co-opt another thing. But I think we can all imagine any number of environments where somebody is being aggressive, which doesn't arc up to that level. So, for instance, let's say that you have two people competing for a parking spot, and somebody slips in front of you, and you get angry, and so perhaps you hit your horn. Or perhaps they roll down the window and they yell at the other person. This verbalization of aggressive feelings, even though it didn't escalate beyond that. So aggression can be a feeling that is then verbalized.
I'm paying attention to the taking of the parking space. That's where the aggression is. The rest of it is, sort of the sound and fury part of it. But it is the taking of the parking place.
Yeah, and the Latin root of aggression comes from to walk toward. So it is this idea of something that's very goal directed, and that's what you're focused on. You're focused on the goal. You're not focused on the other people.
Sure.
So tying it back to this is part of kind of what we talked about with the masculine, that it would be goal directed, that it would be penetrating, seeking.
Well, let us face it bravely. Men are built for thrusting.
Say more about that.
Bows and arrows, spears, guns.
So Freudian.
And then there's a physiological equivalent.
And So if we want to talk about this penetrating, demanding quality, that there are plenty of times where that is considered exciting and welcomed.
Yes.
That's right. And appropriate.
And appropriate.
And I think, I think the danger with a phrase like toxic masculinity is we always paint that as,
Negative.
as negative, right? As that which is undesirable and needs, and is, is bad.
Right. So if we move this into the idea of, let's say, thinking. So let's say you have a woman who's the CEO of a company, and she has a dynamic idea which she feels aggressive and thrusting about, that she wants the board of directors to align with her, that she has a vision and she wants to beget her vision upon the company, and she wants compliance. And we could say that that is an archetypal expression of masculinity.
Absolutely.
And a male CEO could align with a similar behavior. And it's not limited to the physical body.
So I'm back on what is toxic masculinity. I mean, by definition, it would be the pole of what we would archetypally conceive of as being masculine, masculine qualities, the negative pole, as it were, to the exclusion of the positive pole of aggression that is welcome, that is exciting.
Or necessary.
Or necessary, yes.
One of the things that I love about a Jungian worldview is that it is always both and. There is always room for both. And that, I think, is where I start to feel uncomfortable with phrases like toxic masculinity, because whereas sometimes this masculine energy that we're talking about could feel oppressive or limiting. Like, for example, in your example of the female CEO, if you were on the board of directors and you didn't like her idea, you might feel kind of bullied. And you might feel like she was being toxic. You might feel that way. And yet that same kind of energy can bring growth and forward movement, and sometimes even the very constraint that might be imposed by such an energy could be a constraint that leads us toward growth. So it's not, maybe the point is, it's not always so easy to tell when it's toxic and when it's not.
One criteria that I would offer, though, is the difference between being offended versus being injured. So let's just say that there's a form of masculine aggression that's being manifested and that it offends someone's sensibilities. This person on the board decides this idea is not appealing to me, or I feel like I'm forced to align with it. But it is actually an offense of values in the individual. That's quite different than actually being injured by something. So certainly some of the women that are coming forward and saying, I was hurt, I was injured by this person's aggression. I think that's one way of categorizing things that can make us feel more clear. When someone says, I was offended by this movement, by this action in that way, that deserves a different kind of consideration. It certainly deserves a conversation and a dialogue, but I feel that there is a great blurring between those things.
Yeah, that's well put.
I'm kind of thinking about how masculinity can be, like anything else, toxic, but it becomes too one-sided. And that it is kind of goes down to the level almost of name-calling, that if I am offended by something that someone has said, that then I label it, goes back to what I thought about memes, that then it's toxic masculinity because somebody said something that offended me. So that we get into these kind of all or nothing kinds of ways
it's real black and
thinking
white.
that muddy our own ability to really be thoughtful and to consider something more fully, because it's just blanketed with a judgment. And I think we see this in some of the college campuses that have shut speakers down. There have been graduation speakers who've withdrawn because of student protest. There have been all kinds of upsets of people who are considered politically incorrect and hence toxic, whether they're male or female. But it gets into that black and white, all or nothing place of, if this person has views I don't like, they're toxic and have to be silenced.
Right, and that goes to the kind of savage demand to be validated at all costs, which is a form of bullying, that if you do not validate me, then I will punish you and slander you in some fashion, which I think is another form of tyranny. I do want to come back to what you said, because Jung wrote something that I think is really relevant, that people judge when they are too lazy to think.
Oh, did he really say that? That's
He
so
did.
good.
He did. I think he said it a little more elegantly than that. But yes, that we go to right and wrong, or this is good or bad, because we don't have the libido, or we refuse to actually deconstruct what I'm looking at and think through it carefully in some fashion. And that goes to the meme. It's too fast.
Too facile.
Yeah, it's
Too
too
facile.
fast and too facile.
And there's not a thinking process. And if people are lazy, they'll settle for that. They'll settle for generating it, or they'll settle for taking it on. And that is dangerous.
You know, I want to circle back, if I may, to your point about the difference between offense and injury, which I think is that's a pretty good place to draw the line. And although, you know, perhaps it's a little bit difficult to define injury, but, you know, one of the things that I think happens when you see every action that's performed by a man that's offensive as toxic, for women that can result in a loss of agency, because then women are experiencing themselves in the role of the victim.
Absolutely. So in that world, if we could imagine a woman with that broad characterization, then she would feel affronted, unsafe, somehow in danger, even through what would be considered fairly typical masculine attitudes. And maybe even subtle masculine behaviors.
Yeah, I think that probably has happened some.
And as we drop deeper down, do you think, this is really a question, do you think that it also would cause a woman to alienate herself from her own agency because she identifies that with a kind of toxic masculinity that she does not want to be part of?
In other words, by splitting it off as something that belongs to an other, she would then disown her own masculine, assertive qualities in herself?
That's my question. If that could be an unintended, unfortunate consequence.
Well, you know, where that question moves me is I certainly have worked with people who perhaps had a parent who was who had a lot of aggressive capacity, let's just say, and that the relationship with this parent was one that was very wounding. And then later in life, this person's trying to move forward in relationships or professionally and has a lot of trouble claiming a kind of aggressive stance because, you know, the person might say to me, but that would be just like being my mother. I can't be my mother. And what I always try to say, and Deb, I think this goes back to what you were saying before about sort of what aggression is that it's not that we want to become that person. We want to be able to have access to that capacity. And this is why, getting back to toxic masculinity, it's important to split apart the behavior and the attitude and the psychological stance from the person. Because there are times when the right thing to do is to cut yourself off from your concerns about what other people might think if you do something and go ahead and do the hard thing that's going to make other people unhappy. And being able to access that, if we want to call that aggression, and perhaps in some cases it is toxic, and perhaps sometimes it is masculine, but there might be times when that's what is required.
And required even to sustain life.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That there is a way in which being over-identified with the other, with other people, can alienate ourselves from identifying with the self. And if I can lift this up to an archetypal level, I have a great example of this, which is the Bhagavad Gita.
Oh, okay. Say more.
So in Hinduism, there's an enormous epic called the Mahabharata, which is this tremendous mythologic wars and stories. But in the center of the Mahabharata, or, you know, at its kind of climax, there is a great war that has been building, and the forces of darkness and evil are threatening to extinguish all light in the world. And Krishna has manifested as an avatar of Vishnu, who is the god of salvation, the god who preserves goodness in the world. And he has incarnated specifically for this moment. Krishna's best friend is Arjuna, who is the perfect warrior. The stage has been set where Arjuna and the warriors who are aligned with goodness, along with Krishna, are on one side of the battlefield, and the forces of darkness, who are the stepbrothers of Arjuna, who are the uncles, who are the family members on the other side of fighting for the darkness, are right on the battlefield. And Arjuna turns to Krishna and says, I can't do this. That I feel so much empathy for my uncle who's over on the other side and my stepbrothers. I cannot go to war. I cannot be aggressive. And in the story, Krishna sits down on the battlefield and unfolds to Arjuna the nature of the universe. The crux of it is, and Arjuna finally comes to believe, that the primary allegiance of the individual is to the self, is to the Godhead, is to destiny. And in that way, Arjuna must align with his destiny to be the perfect warrior and to win this battle so light can survive. And in fact, is brought to that clarity. It's a terrible battle. It claims even Krishna's life eventually, but that light survives.
So in that moment, what is required is aggression.
Yes.
And that might be kind of a mythological example of like a mature masculinity, right?
Aggression in service to the self, in service to something that is higher, a greater calling and a destiny, which can divorce us at times from that soft relatedness.
So that's a great example. And I want to have another example from a fairy tale, and it's so different, but it's kind of in the same territory, and it deals with sort of maybe the psyche of a woman. So if I may, at the end of the ancient Greek fairy tale Psyche and Eros, Psyche, her last task to be restored to her lover is she has to descend into the underworld and retrieve Aphrodite's beauty box. And the advice she's given is, when you go into the underworld, there are going to be all these shades who are going to want something from you. They're going to pull at your garments. They're going to plead with you. You have to stop up your ears and ignore them. You have to be selfish. And I bring that up a lot when I work, particularly with women, because women do have a hard time saying, I'm going to just do this for me. I'm going to take that parking space. I'm going to find my aggressive capacity to go after what really matters to me. Parking space is not maybe the best example in that sense, but when it's something like, I know I need to be doing a different kind of job, for example. But if I push my way into that situation, I might offend somebody or trample on somebody. But sometimes we don't always want to live right there, because then we're just not nice people and we're not well-related people. But there are times when we have to cut ourselves off from our sense of relatedness in order to live in service to something larger.
Doesn't it seem to you, though, that women, a more typical conflict would be the woman who wants to go back to work even though she has young children at home, and that there is a real cost to those young children being relegated to daycare centers or whatever else, and that it might be much better for them if mom were at home all day, and mom just plain doesn't want to be home all day, and that there is aggression in it of saying, I'm going to do something for myself, even though there is a cost to other people.
Yes.
Unlike Psyche, there's no cost to anybody else. They're shades, and she's clearly in the service of something greater. But there's a lot of ambiguity around this.
Oh, yes.
In the lived life. Absolutely.
In the lived life, and who's to say whether this woman or the person who takes the parking space is just being selfish or doing something that is really part of his or her individuation.
Right. How do we know?
I really need to do this.
I want to lift this up to another theoretical level, which is essential around the difference between Jungian analysis and Freudian psychoanalysis, is that Freud had a mechanistic view of the psyche where events were causal, that I was having a particular experience now in my life which was caused by certain kinds of unresolved conflicts in my childhood. And this kind of mechanism of causality tends to engender empathy. So Jung had an energic or an energy-based view of the psyche, and he would imagine psychological energy flowing much like water. So he would imagine a gradient or a hill forming inside his inner landscape, and life force would flow down the hill towards an image or an idea that would accumulate energy and drive him forward. And he said that that view of how we move in the world doesn't engender empathy because it doesn't suggest causality, but that it does compel us forward in tremendous creative ways that are self-generated and in some ways not necessarily considerate of the environment in the same way that polite society might want us to be.
So we're sort of bringing up this idea about when transgressing kind of polite norms might be in service to growth, and that's something that we might associate with masculine energy that might sometimes be called toxic.
Misdirected as toxic when the idea, just as Deb is saying, is used like a meme.
Yeah.
That men or anything suggestive of men has somehow been disenfranchised or demonized. That there's something deeper that has to be considered.
I'm thinking about libido. That image that Jung offered of energy flowing downhill, the gradient, is about libido. It's about just energy. And we're calling it aggression, but it is our life energy. And we've all known people who don't seem to have a lot of life energy or a lot of libido, which for Jung was just life energy. For Freud, it was more sexual. But how that gets applied and what is it in service to? And how do we live a really good, rich, full life that has energy in it that is probably going to be misapplied, misunderstood, misused from time to time.
And might sometimes hurt others.
Yes.
I feel like we're kind of drawing to a close, but there's a piece we haven't kind of landed in the room that feels important. And, I did look up quickly where this phrase originated, and it appears that it may have originated in the mythopoetic men's movement, which really surprised me. And they used it, and this would be the men's movement in the 90s, of which Robert Bly and Michael Meade were major figures. And it appears that they used it to mean those societally imposed expectations of men that are hurtful to society and men themselves. So, Joseph, I know you've spoken about the expectations that some of the men in your practice have for themselves, for example, around sexuality, that hurts them because what they really want is intimacy, for example, but they're supposed to be macho, And I think I can work with toxic masculinity used in that way and have seen that myself so many times. This is not a very popular or politically correct thing to say, but I've been honored to work with many men. And, a lot of men really suffer because of the expectations that they're held to by our culture.
I would say that that's true. And even though the men's movement itself seems to have lost steam, but I think the sensibility and the sensitivity to the story, the narrative about what a man should look like, how a man should behave, is too superficial to allow the spirit of an individual man to blossom, to find its way of moving through the world. And I think that there is both offense and injury that is even encouraged when gross forms of this broad behavior is pushed into a young man.
It's very easy to fall into polarities of this is masculine, this is feminine, this is toxic, this is benign, this is one thing or the other. And I go back to what you said about Jung saying that judgments were indications of lazy thinking or being too lazy to think. So perhaps, I hope, we have encouraged people to circumambulate some of these things along with us, and that it's more complicated than these simple memes often indicate.
Well, that feels like the right place to transition to a dream. We have a dream today that, let's see, the dreamer is female and she is 39. And here's the dream.
I am walking on what seems to be mountainous hills. A little ahead of me is what feels like my teenage daughter and a friend. It's kind of like twilight. Then I see a giant-sized footprint on the hillside. Huge, like a natural wonder of the world type sight. I point at it the way one does when one sees something pretty or interesting on holidays. Then I take a photo.
I'm struck by the juxtaposition between the magnitude of the gigantic footprint and the casual tourist attitude of taking a snapshot of it in some way that strikes me. It strikes me about our culture, but also strikes me about the dreamer's attitude.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that is definitely the thing that jumps out, right? Is that juxtaposition. I'm just going to look and see what the dreamer says. So she says, this is the question, is there any significant context? And she says, yes, a relationship has just ended and it is a shock for me. I have also moved home, which was very strongly against my better judgment. And she did say in terms of feeling, she said there's lack of any drama. The footprint was very vivid. It's almost an ordinary everyday feel to the taking the photo and pointing to it. So that kind of backs up our sense of it, that there's a real contrast between the nature of the image, which clearly is this incredibly kind of numinous, here is evidence of the God kind of,
Yeah.
versus, oh, look at that, right. Click. I'll put it on Instagram now.
Exactly. Make it into a meme.
A natural wonder of the world that is taken very casually. And the dreamer says that there was lack of drama and it was an ordinary, everyday kind of feeling in the dream.
I'm struck by, as I'm thinking about that, the teenage daughter in the dream, that her own return to live at her parents' house and the possibility that could return her to a teenage attitude. And thinking about my own life as a teenager, that the often superficial attitudes that I might have as a teenager as I encounter various, in retrospect, very big events, but I'm unable to make sense of them, the magnitude of them. And I'm wondering if the footprint is the struggle she's having to really own the kind of footprint or impression that the lost relationship has made upon her.
Yeah.
That it has left a big footprint in her psyche. And she's perhaps treating it, as something to take a little snapshot of and send home.
Yeah, that would be an interesting thing, I think, if I had this dreamer in my office. Like, more about the footprint. Like, does it seem terrifying? Because, certainly this could be terrifying, right? If there's something that big, it could step on you and squash you.
Particularly if it's a fresh footprint.
Or is it more is there a sense more of awe? Like, wow, there's such a creature who exists, And I think it could be both terrifying and awe-inspiring.
Well, she says, I point at it like the way one does when someone sees something pretty or interesting on the holiday. So she's handling it fairly lightly.
Yeah, there's a sense that she's not, and I think you were getting at this, that she's not acknowledging the bigness of something.
The feeling that I'm starting to have just in myself with regard to this dream, which may be picking up something in the dream or even the dreamer, is there's a tremendous defense going on here against perhaps sadness, overwhelm. Something huge has happened. Something huge has gone by. Something huge has stepped here. Something big has happened. And that has to do with stance, because it's a footprint. It's not a handprint of how we walk through life, our standpoint in life. And she says she moved back home, quote, against her better judgment. So I have the feeling that the dream is trying to tell the dreamer something really big is going on here. And here is its sign right here in front of you. It's at like a World Heritage Site.
Yeah.
This is big. And the dream ego is saying, it's not that big a deal. I just take a photo. It's a great example of the compensatory function of the unconscious.
Say more about what you mean by compensatory function.
Well, we all have our conscious attitude of what we think or believe, how we perceive things. And then at night, Psyche, our dream maker, comes along to tell us often how very differently that is being perceived by psyche, by the unconscious. And this is a great example of that. The dream ego is in a very calm, benign, no big deal kind of attitude. And yet what has happened here is really big. It's a big footprint. As you said, Lisa, it's like the God has stepped here. And it is a huge natural wonder of the world type site. This is not something small. And so we see the unconscious saying, pay attention.
I like everything you said, and I want to just layer
good.
thing. I want to layer one thing on top of it, which is, I think you're right. The psyche's saying something big has gone by here and you should pay attention. And I'm curious about the nature of the big thing, because this is a gigantic being, humanoid being, whatever. So I do wonder about the transpersonal nature of what has happened. Mm-hmm. It may be that something very sad has gone by that the ego is not tending to, but I think it's also something transpersonal.
Can you land that imaginally in a person's life? Like, what would that look like?
Well, I'm making this up, right?
Yeah.
But say that Deb is going right down the right road, which I think she probably is, that maybe there's something unacknowledged about the end of the relationship or moving home or some aspect in the dreamer's life about how big this is. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's a defense against it. And that bigness of it might, if she were not so defended against it, might lead her into a sort of, initiatory experience of her own depths. That she might touch into something that was spiritual or transformative about that experience. Yeah. I mean, again, I'm just sort of making it up.
Riffing on it. And also, you brought up something that I think is also very possible, is yes, she had this very shocking breakup or ending of a relationship, but she's also returned home. And returning home as an adult sometimes can allow us to perceive and understand the impact that our parents have had on us in a way that we couldn't have had when we were kids. To see the enormity of the footprints
that's interesting.
that our parents' psyches leave in us, and that it may be that she's, or that's trying to surface in the psyche, and the photograph, which is really a memory, that she's trying to make an impression upon herself about the level of that impact.
Yeah. That's an interesting...
That's such a good point, because there's the contrast again in her life situation, that she has moved back home against my better judgment. But again, time will tell. It may be that Psyche has a wisdom here for her to find something in this regression back to a child place in her parents' home, and the footprints that have been left there, that she can metabolize in a different way now.
That could very well be related to why the relationship failed, or perhaps even why she might have made an unskilled choice of partners, driven by the footprints left in her psyche, based on her early upbringing, and which I think is probably true for all of us, by the way.
Yeah.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.